Over 16,000 biographies of President Abraham Lincoln have been published since his death, more than any other American political figure. And yet scholars, leaders, and history buffs remain fascinated by his complicated genius and significance to the American story. For today's conversation, two preeminent historians discuss new perspectives on President Lincoln. David S. Reynolds is widely considered one of the greatest historians of 19th century America. His prize-winning books include biographies of Walt Whitman, Andrew Jackson, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. His latest book, Abe, Abraham Lincoln in His Times, is a cultural biography focusing on how Lincoln was shaped by his tumultuous era.
Hi, Bill.
Hi, David. Good to see you. How's the
Good
book
to see
business
you,
going?
and congrats on your book, The Zealot and the Emancipator.
Well, thank you. And
Yeah.
I'm delighted for you at the wonderful reception your book on Abe has been getting. So
Thank you.
why don't you go first, since you've been sort of in the Abraham Lincoln era in business longer than I have. Tell me what inspired you, if you would, to take the angle on Lincoln that you did.
Yeah, basically, I got inspired because I've spent most of my career studying his period, the period of the pre-Civil War era, and it was the greatest period in our literary history with Melville, Hawthorne, Poe, Whitman, Emerson, Thoreau, all those people. And I noticed that in book after book on Lincoln, frankly, a lot of the cultural background was left out. And it turns out that a lot of these people were interested in Lincoln and kind of commenting on him. Emerson said that Lincoln was the one statesman in history, really, who traversed the whole range of experience. From the highest, he could recite Shakespeare by the page, to the lowest, he liked sort of dirty jokes, and in the middle, he loved sentimental, sappy poems and so forth, and also songs. So I was interested in that whole interchange between Lincoln and his culture, because after all, we know today that a lot of politics is defined by our culture, and the way our local culture intersects with certain strands in the larger culture. And in a sense, that sort of largely defines our politics. And so I'm interested in that whole interchange.
I want to ask a question that's motivated by the last thing that you said. I agree entirely that very much of politics is explained by culture. But I would say that in my study of people like Lincoln and Henry Clay and Daniel Webster and John Calhoun, I was struck by, in that era, how it seemed so many ordinary people were quite up on, in some cases, really detailed political issues. And if you consider the response to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, I mean, those debates were carried on at such a higher level than, presidential debates today, that it made me, one would get the impression at first glance that everybody there in the audience had a PhD in political science. I mean, because they were the speakers, Lincoln and Douglas, and Lincoln throughout his life, never spoke down to audiences.
And if you read those debates, which you have read very closely, one debater would speak for, let's say, an hour, and the other for an hour, and then rejoinder for half an hour. It wasn't our 2 minutes clips or 3 minute clips or something like that, and then you're cut off. Back then, they didn't have they didn't have the internet, they didn't have streaming, they didn't have Twitter. Nothing was really soundbite. And when they read, a lot of them, even a lot of the newspaper articles and the magazine articles are quite detailed. And when you think about Lincoln, he had less than 1 year of schooling, 3 months at one age and 3 months at another age. He lived on the frontier, and it was really crummy schooling. It's kind of like Frederick Douglass had like zero schooling. Walt Whitman had almost no schooling. But even these completely unschooled figures back then, they would read they would read. That's kind of almost all they had. They had some musical performances, a little theater and so forth, but they would read and they fed their mind. And just thinking, the literacy rate was quite high, particularly in the North at that time. And Lincoln was sort of infinitely curious himself. And you're absolutely right to say that a lot of the electorate was more informed on the issues than, frankly, a lot of the electorate is today, or at least able to think through a lot of these issues. So that, yeah, these debates are on an extremely high level.
You mentioned the unschooled nature of the figures that you identified. I studied Benjamin Franklin, who was also essentially unschooled. And I came to conclude in Franklin's case, I think it applies to Lincoln and some of the others you identify, that there is a positive benefit in a certain regard to not having been in school. When you're in school, one of the things you learn is what you're supposed to know, but you conclude by default that what's not in school, you don't have to learn. But if you don't go to school, you never know what you don't have to learn. And so certainly somebody like Franklin, I think this applies to Lincoln as well, never stopped learning, because he always sort of felt there was a little bit of kind of maybe an inferiority complex where when you were around people who had had this polished education, you always thought they knew something you didn't know. And so you had this incentive, this drive to continue learning. And I think that's very striking about both Franklin and about Lincoln.
You as an author and me as an author, we both realize that for every topic that we undertake, there's so much more to learn. And we're on a constant progress toward trying to find more knowledge. And Lincoln and Franklin had they were both kind of humble people, as was Frederick Douglass, actually, knowing that in a way they had to, and Walt Whitman, the same thing, they had to feed their mind. And in a way, as you said, in part because they didn't have official schooling, and life itself was an education and reading and so forth. So, yeah.
So you said you sort of wanted to recreate the cultural world of Abraham Lincoln. What I wanted to get at was the moral world of Abraham Lincoln, but not just of Lincoln, of his times. And the question that motivated me to study Abraham Lincoln and John Brown and put the two together was an abiding question that certainly citizens in a democracy have to face. And that is, what do you do when you think your government is on the wrong track? And this can be waging an unjust war, or it can be sustaining an ugly and an unjust institution like slavery. And so, I sort of make the case obliquely that this comes up in every generation. And the operative question for me, well, there are two. One is the sort of the moral question, what constitutes right and wrong in a political universe? But beyond that, to me, the more interesting question is, once you've concluded that something is wrong, what do you do about it? And to get at this question in the period of the sectional crisis and the Civil War, I was drawn to John Brown and Abraham Lincoln because they both agreed that slavery was quite wrong. But they disagreed dramatically, violently indeed, on what to do about it. Abraham Lincoln was the thorough pragmatist. He was a man of the law. He revered the Constitution and the Union. And so Abraham Lincoln felt constrained in acting against slavery by the Constitution. And he placed the Union higher than emancipation because he believed that emancipation would only come lastingly, legally, constitutionally, through the Union and the Constitution. John Brown, by contrast, he wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a political figure. He was simply an ordinary person who couldn't figure out how to make a success in life. And I've sometimes wondered about John Brown. If he tried his hand at farming, at businesses of various kinds, and just never sort of found himself. And it was partly because he lacked the particular competence for each of those things, but they didn't engage his real energy. And there was sort of a moral heart to John Brown that wanted to be engaged. Watching Brown conclude that violence is indeed justified against slavery because slavery is so evil, and slavery daily commits violence against all within its oppressive grasp. But Lincoln takes a different view, and his view was that, no, this, first of all, isn't the right way to do it. It's not the legal way to do it. And Lincoln, I think, understood something that John Brown didn't or wasn't willing to acknowledge, and that is, if you're going to live in a democracy, you have to do this ultimately by persuasion. Now, sometimes, as it turned out, the persuasion that led to the 13th Amendment was assisted by the compulsion of the war, but it was by constitutional means that slavery was finally ended in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. You said that so well. And the abolitionist movement arises in the 1830s, and the radical abolitionists like Garrison and so forth really rejected the government and rejected the Constitution, because they thought that, even to this very day, some people interpret the Constitution itself as pro-slavery. The original Constitution is pro-slavery. And so Garrison would burn that and burn the Declaration of Independence in public. And John Brown rewrote the Constitution. He wrote his own provisional Constitution of the United States, which in the first paragraph comes out against slavery. And he also rewrote the Declaration of Independence, and because it was hypocritical. And then, of course, after the Dred Scott decision, he thought about violence in the 1840s, but after the Dred Scott decision, which said Black people cannot be citizens and they have no rights that white people have to respect. And that really drove him over the edge to, of course, he had already been to Kansas, but now this drove him really to Harper's Ferry and to violence. And yeah, Lincoln absolutely detached himself from John Brown. John Brown detached himself from politics, and Lincoln detached himself from John Brown, because his party, the Republican Party, was being charged with being accomplices of John Brown, which was really ridiculous, because that party, Lincoln wanted to guide the party, as you just said, toward the electoral process. There's a certain process that we have in America called elections, whereas John Brown was a fan of the higher laws, something higher than the Constitution. The trouble with the higher law is that can be taken in any direction. The Southerners followed their higher law. They were just as Christian. And Lincoln said they went to war with the same Bibles. They believed in the same God and everything. They had their perfectly higher law, which was that slavery was a sacred, it was a wonderful God-given institution. So the trouble with John Brown then becomes, in a way, you can take this higher law in kind of any way you want to, which is why abortion doctor murderers in recent times have taken John Brown as their example. I'm not sure that John Brown would support these murderers and so forth. Whereas Lincoln knew that, yes, persuasion and logic, and also trying to get the founding fathers on board with the Republican vision. The Republicans were the liberals of that day. And he said, okay, some of them were slaveholders, but you know what? At Cooper Union, he says, look, if you, the majority of the people at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 were basically anti-slavery. They looked forward to the extinction of slavery. So he really tried to use logic and persuasion to bring the founding father. And then at Gettysburg, of course, he brings human equality to the very heart of the American experience. But he does all this right through elections and through speeches and persuasion. And now in the end, as you point out in your book, they kind of converge, the John Brown approach and the Lincoln approach, toward the end of the war. And Lincoln even begins to mention some of John Brown's tactics, but that's only because he's gotten there through hard war, a very tragic war. But he's reached that point where we say, well, we're going to have to use sort of extreme violence to end slavery. And that's what it took. It took Grant and Sherman and Farragut and all those people. So, yeah.
Well, I agree with your argument entirely that once you start appealing to a higher law, there's no telling where this will end up, because basically it means that each individual is the judge of what the law should be. And as often as I argue that, and as often as I point out that, yes, although Brown was this charismatic figure, Lincoln was the one who actually took what Brown wanted to happen and made it happen. The John Brown, with the exception of the dozen or so slaves he actually led to freedom in Canada, didn't free any slaves. And arguably, I mean, one can make the argument that the abolitionists did almost nothing of themselves to free any slaves. If anything, in many cases, they made the condition of slaves in the short term worse. And certainly, slaves in the South had less freedom after John Brown's Harper's Ferry raid because slaveholders figured, oh my God, there might be a slave insurrection that's going to happen around here. But having said all that, and I think that Lincoln's way through the Constitution toward emancipation was really the only way it could happen. But having said all that, very often to the audiences that I speak to and among some of my students, John Brown seems the more appealing figure because John Brown, well, in the first place, this makes all the difference in the world, of course. John Brown turned out to be on the right side of history, and he just got there first. And so it's as though John Brown knew where history was going and got there ahead of Lincoln. And he went there sort of eagerly. He embraced the future. With Lincoln, you know, when you know how it's going to turn out, when you write about Lincoln, you know this even better than I, you sort of have to explain away, or at least you have to explain Lincoln's slowness to get there. And you mentioned Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was very annoyed with Lincoln at how long it took him to get to the Emancipation Proclamation, because of course, Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist, but not a violent abolitionist like John Brown. In fact, there's a moment that I describe in the book where John Brown, just before he's about to take off for Harper's Ferry, tries to talk Frederick Douglass into joining the raid. And John Brown understands that Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave, a black man himself, would increase the credibility of this operation enormously, because the enslaved people that John Brown wants to free, they're going to see this white guy and say, well, who are you? You know, and why should I trust you with my life? Because really, that's what he was acting to do, to risk their lives for this operation that they had just heard of at that particular moment. But Frederick Douglass declined. And I think part of it was Frederick Douglass said, you know, I risk my life for my own freedom. I'm not going to throw my life away for this harebrained scheme that John Brown had. I think he also recognized that there was no way John Brown's project was going to work. The Harper's Ferry raid was
when Frederick Douglass looked back on John Brown after the Civil War, he said that his devotion to abolitionism was like the burning sun to my flaming candle. That is to say, he realized that, and he also said that I could live for my race. John Brown died for my race. So retrospectively, he realized what, you know, and because he had the vision that, okay, this was after all the amendments that abolished slavery. And he realized that a lot of the events that John Brown triggered kind of led to the fall of slavery. But at the same time, after the Civil War, Douglass said about Lincoln, he said, from the abolitionist standpoint, Lincoln was, as you mentioned, slow, lethargic, dull. But he said, given the temper of the times, he was rapid and zealous and radical, because it was talk about systemic racism. Lincoln lived in a state, Illinois, that had what Douglass called the worst black law of any state in the Union, the 1853 Negro Exclusion Act, which said if you were a black person and you wanted to enter Illinois and weren't already there, you're going to get kicked out within 10 days or go to jail or pay a heavy fine. And that's why even in the Lincoln Douglas debates when he was in Southern Illinois, Lincoln sometimes says certain things that people cherry pick and say, oh my God, he's a racist or something. He was running for office. And it turns out that the guy he was running against, Stephen Douglas, was an unabashed racist, just a white man's government forever. And he won that election. He didn't win the popular vote, but he won the gerrymandered district vote. And so that's what really appealed. And so Lincoln had to be very, very careful in his public. And in my book, he compared himself, and many cartoonists and everything of that day compared him to Blondin, this tightrope walker who went back and forth across Niagara Falls, sometimes with a person on his back, sometimes pushing a wheelbarrow, sometimes on 4 feet stilts. And during the war, when Lincoln was approached a couple of times by people who says, why can't you make this a more anti-slavery war from the very beginning? He said, if I were blonde and pushing my wheelbarrow above Niagara Falls and it had the entire American future in it, would you say, Blondin, lean left, Blondin, lean right? No, I have to keep on my center. I have to keep on my rope. If I say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing right now, what's going to happen is we're going to lose Kentucky. We're going to lose one of the border states, Missouri, Kentucky. There were 5 border states that were slaveholding states. But and he said, if we lose them, we're just going to lose the war. That's all. We're going to lose the war. So at the beginning, he did have to be, really, really cautious, even though, as you mentioned earlier, he hated slavery just as much as John Brown.
So even during the war, he brings to the White House some Black ministers, and he tries to get them to lead a movement of freed Black people out of the United States to somewhere else, because Lincoln had a hard time imagining that in a democracy, white people and Black people, with the history that whites and Blacks had between them in the United States, could live fruitfully and peacefully. And I would like to be able to say from the distance of 2021 how wrong Lincoln was, but I can't. We can't. He understood that this was a real problem.
That was called colonization, right. And it was one of the most popular ideas. Jefferson, Monroe, Jackson, Harry Beecher Stowe, even Henry David Thoreau, but nothing ever really came of it. I mean, 13,000 African Americans were between 1816 and 1865 went on ships abroad to Liberia and so forth. And that Lincoln thing was he had already drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, and the African American group comes in and he says some sort of conservative things, some sort of backward things. And some Chicago ministers come in and say, "Where's the Emancipation Proclamation?" He said, I couldn't issue that. He had already written it. He said, I can't issue that because that would be like the Pope making an edict against the comet. That's it would be totally useless. And then Horace Greeley says, will you please, hurry up on slavery? He said, I don't care if the Union, has slavery, it doesn't have slavery. That was Blondin leaning way right, because he knew that the Emancipation Proclamation was really going to be an explosive thing, which it was, both for good and for bad.
Right.
His supporters, loved him, but a lot of people in the North, that's when the whole Copperhead thing really takes off. And they assault him with all this racist thing. It becomes a, quote, N war. I don't like to use the word N in public, but an N war. And then the whole 1864 races about how Lincoln is an N lover, and all that kind of thing. So the Emancipation Proclamation really is a controversial thing. And to prepare for that, yeah, of course, he says this colonization should be voluntary. He had plans in his mind, but they quickly fizzled, and then he kind of forgot about all that. So, yeah.
Well, one of the ironies of that is that because of the end of the legal international slave trade to America, African Americans by the 1860s, in most cases, had deeper American roots than most non-African Americans, because among the white folks, there were millions coming from Europe all the time. And so the basic reason that the colonization in Africa didn't pan out was it turned out the African Americans are too American to make the adjustment. I'd like to hear your take on the evolution of Lincoln's religious views during the Civil War. Because I have this impression that before the Civil War, Lincoln was not particularly religious, and he certainly didn't show he didn't wear his religious views on his sleeve by any means. But by the end of the war, it's as though, here's my reading, and I'd like your take. Lincoln is more than any single person responsible for the decisions that gave rise to this war. Now, of course, there were the institutional forces, but if Lincoln had said, let them go in peace in 1861, there wouldn't have been a civil war. But Lincoln said, no, they can't. And he felt he was obliged to do it by his constitutional oath and all this, but nonetheless. So this war has come, and the war turned out to be bloodier than anybody imagined. It's hard to think that anybody on either side, if they knew what the death toll was going to be by 1865, would said, yeah, this is the way we're going to go. But Lincoln becomes more overtly religious in the course of this war. So is this Lincoln appealing to the conscience of Americans? Because during wartime, even fairly irreligious presidents do this. Or is Lincoln experiencing something of a conversion, or at least an evolution of his religious thinking within his own mind and soul?
Well, it's such a wonderful topic, because religion becomes so important to Lincoln. He never did join a church. He was born in a Baptist family. He didn't read the Bible that much when he was young. When he grew up, he would read it just he loved to read the Bible and quote from it, even The House Divided. A lot of his speeches are kind of based on the Bible, but he was not really a churchgoer. His wife, Mary, was more, and sometimes he would go with her. He said that I would join the church that just believed in the golden rule, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And that's all. So in a way, he was like Jefferson. Jefferson went through the Bible and cut out all the supernatural elements of it and loved the kind of moral, the moral resonance of it and the passages and so forth. So, or Franklin, the same thing, who reduced religion to like these 5 points. Unlike them, however, Jefferson was a deist and Franklin was a deist. Lincoln was a deist is someone who believes that, God created the universe and he left these laws, these physical laws that we can use our reason to figure out. And my brain is my God, my theology and my Bible, and I figure out God's laws in the universe. But Lincoln really does come to believe, certainly during the Civil War, I would even say a little before that, a sense of a mysterious higher power that is in control. In 1862, he writes the Meditation on Divine Will, in which he says, and this is just to himself, who was a scrap of paper, writing about God. He said, I don't know how this war is going to end up. He'll make it right or wrong. I can only pursue what I feel is right. At Gettysburg, he adds the phrase under God instinctively in the last sentence, the nation under God. And some people say he had a conversion at Gettysburg. I really don't believe he had a conversion, but there was a deepening of religious sensibility. And I think that this happens largely as a result of the death of Willie in 1862, where he's visited by ministers and he gets consolation from these ministers. He really gets, not that he has a conversion, but he gets real consolation. And during the Battle of Gettysburg, there's a story that he got down on his knees and he prayed. So by the end of the war, in the second inaugural address in 1865, that's virtually a sermon. It has so many references to the Bible, references to God, and so forth. And when Frederick Douglass met him later, he said, that was a sacred effort. And the word sacred, I think, really defines the Gettysburg Address. I mean, the second inaugural, where Lincoln says that, whether this war goes on for, hundreds of years or whatever, by that time, the war was just about over, as is said in the Bible. And then he, quotes about, God's justice being wreaked, so that every lash inflicted on the slave is repaid by the sword, and that's God's judgment. And he goes on and on about, these biblical quotations. So, yeah.
How much of our interpretation of Lincoln, and for that matter, John Brown, because you mentioned how he was thought of after his death, is shaped by the fact that Lincoln dies at the moment, he's killed at the moment of victory?
Yeah, I mean, John Brown is hanged on the gallows. He dies for the enslaved people, and Lincoln is killed by a white supremacist actor who today would be on People magazine, the sexiest guy alive, John Wilkes Booth. But inwardly, he was really, really an ugly person, and he kills him in the theater. Absolutely. His martyrdom in part contributes to his retrospective greatness. Walt Whitman said, a people are defined by what Whitman called their heroic eminent deaths, the deaths of heroic eminent people, as much as by constitutions, as much as by laws, as much as by anything. Martin Luther King, Abraham Lincoln, and for a long time, John Brown, who remained until Jim Crow, a venerated, almost godlike figure. To be sure, there was a lot of both hagiography and also retrospective sort of sanctification of Lincoln. And I think it's our responsibility as historians, your responsibility and mine, to kind of revisit and say, hey, what was sort of actually going on back then? And maybe go through the mist of sanctification a little, if we can. It's even hard, though, I know, for you, for me, for anyone to really break through that mist. But
yeah. David, it's joy talking to you, as always. And I recommend everybody to get a copy of your book, which I believe is available at Left Bank Books.
I want to recommend your book, too. And here's my paperback, which just came out. So
congratulations on
Left Bank Books is the place to go. So, Bill, it's been great. Wonderful to talk with you.